The morning sun rose over New Canaan, like it had for the past 20 years since the colony was established on this distant world, casting golden light across endless fields of wheat that swayed in the gentle breeze while children laughed and played. Near the community center where their parents gathered for the weekly market day, Sarah Chun walked alongside her classmates through the agricultural district. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, pointing out the irrigation systems that made this world bloom with life. Despite being so far from Earth that the journey took 3 months, even at faster-than-light speeds. Remember, class, Mrs. Rodriguez said with a warm smile, our ancestors chose to come here because they believed in building something new and peaceful, away from the crowded cities of Earth and the old conflicts that once plagued humanity. The 12-year-old girl nodded while looking at the massive grain silos in the distance, thinking about how her grandmother always said that farming was the most honest work anyone could do, because you put seeds in the ground and life came out if you cared for it. Properly, 50,000 people called New Canaan home now, and every single one of them had chosen the hard work of building a colony over the easier life back on the core worlds where everything already existed and nothing required the calloused hands that Sarah saw on her father every evening when he returned from the fields. The class trip that day took them to the northern mining region where geological surveys had found rare minerals useful for the colony's expansion, and Mrs. Rodriguez explained how they would extract only what they needed while preserving the natural beauty of the caves and rock formations that made this area so spectacular. Sarah and her best friend Tommy ran ahead of the group when they reached the mining observation post, pressing their faces against the transparent aluminum windows to watch the automated diggers working far below in the massive excavation site that looked like a giant bowl carved into the red stone. Look how deep it goes, Tommy said with wonder in his voice. And Sarah agreed that it was amazing how humans could build such things while still keeping the environment safe and clean. Mrs. Rodriguez led them down into the educational tunnel that had been prepared for school visits. A safe corridor with lighting and information displays about mining techniques and geological history, and the children spread out to read the various exhibits while their teacher answered questions. That was when the alarms started screaming throughout the facility with a sound that none of them had ever heard before, because New Canaan had never experienced an emergency beyond the occasional weather event or equipment malfunction. The observation post supervisor ran past them shouting into his communicator about unknown vessels in orbit, and Sarah saw fear in his eyes that made her stomach twist with sudden anxiety. Everyone into the deep shelter now, Mrs. Rodriguez commanded with a voice that had lost all its earlier warmth and become hard with urgency, and she began pushing the children toward a reinforced door that Sarah had never noticed before through the windows above them. Sarah caught a glimpse of fire falling from the sky like deadly rain, and the ground began to shake as explosions thundered across the colony with a violence that seemed impossible in this peaceful place. Tommy grabbed her hand as Mrs. Rodriguez shoved them through the shelter door along with 6 other students, and the teacher's face was pale as she sealed the entrance behind them with hands that trembled. Stay quiet and stay together, Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, but her voice cracked on the last word, and Sarah realized with horror that their teacher was crying. The shelter was a deep mining tunnel that extended far underground, equipped with basic supplies and communication equipment that now crackled with desperate voices from across the colony calling for help that would never come. Sarah and the other children huddled in the darkness lit only by emergency lights while the world above them died in fire and screaming, and through the communication system they could hear their parents and friends begging for mercy from attackers who gave none. The voices spoke in a language Sarah didn't recognize, harsh and clicking sounds that accompanied threats broadcast. In broken human standard about submission and consequences for those who refuse to acknowledge their betters. In the galactic order, for 6 hours the bombardment continued with methodical precision as the alien warship Zathron vessels, as the communications identified them systematically, destroyed every building, every farm, every shelter where humans might survive. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to shield the children from the audio feeds, but Sarah heard her mother's voice cut off mid-sentence in a scream that would haunt her nightmares forever. And she heard her father calling her name one last time before static replaced his words. Tommy stopped responding to anything around him and just rocked back and forth with his eyes closed. And 2 of the younger children cried until they had no tears left, while the others sat in shocked silence when the bombardment finally stopped. The communications went completely dead, except for a single automated message, repeating coordinates and a distress beacon that pulsed out into the void, hoping that someone would hear it. Mrs. Rodriguez tried to smile at her students and tell them it would be okay. But then she walked to the far end of the tunnel and sat down against the wall where she thought they couldn't see her shoulders shaking. With silent sobs, 3 days passed in that tunnel, with the lights growing dimmer as power reserves depleted and the air recyclers working at maximum capacity to keep 9 people breathing while the water supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Sarah kept the younger children calm by telling them stories about Earth that her grandmother had told her, tales of mountains and oceans and cities so tall they touched the clouds. Anything to keep their minds away from what weighed above them in the ashes of their world. On the 3rd day, new sounds echoed through the rock above them, different from the Zathron attack. And Mrs. Rodriguez activated the emergency beacon with hands that shook from dehydration and fear. A human patrol ship on routine border sweep picked up the signal and landed near the mining facility. And when the rescue team cut through the sealed door, they found 8 children and 1 teacher barely alive in the darkness. The rescue captain carried Sarah out of the tunnel himself, but she wished he hadn't, because the surface of New Canaan was gone in every direction, replaced by blackened glass and ash where forests and fields had grown that very morning. "Don't look," the captain said. But Sarah had already seen everything, including the message the Zathrons had left behind in their own language, painted across the ruined community center in symbols that translated to a simple threat about the price of human weakness. They took her aboard the ship along with the other survivors. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't make it through the first night in medical care because her body had simply given up after keeping her students alive for 72 hours. Sarah Chun became the voice of New Canaan when the patrol ship brought them back to the nearest human station. And she stood before the Admiralty board and told them everything in a quiet voice that never wavered, even when describing the sounds of 50,000 people dying. The admirals listened in complete silence. And when she finished, the Secretary General of the Human Colonial Authority stood up from his chair with a face carved from stone and spoke 3 words that changed everything. "Release the fleet." Sarah didn't understand what those words meant, but she saw something wake up in the eyes of every military officer in the room. Something old and terrible that humanity had kept locked away for 200 years. They told her to rest and promised her that New Canaan would be answered. But Sarah couldn't sleep that night because somewhere deep in her heart she felt the galaxy shift beneath her feet. Admiral Marcus Thorne had been retired for 15 years, living in a quiet cottage in the Scottish Highlands, where he spent his days fishing and trying to forget the things he had done during humanity's last great war against itself. But the call came at 3 in the morning, and he knew before answering that his peace was over. The voice on the other end belonged to the Secretary General himself, and the old admiral listened without interrupting as the details of New Canaan's destruction poured through the speaker. along with a request that was really in order to return to service immediately. "Sir, I haven't commanded a ship since the Cairo Accords," Thorne said quietly. "And I agreed with those accords because I believed we had moved past the need for what I represented." The Secretary General's response was cold and final. "The accords included Protocol Omega for a reason, Admiral. And that reason just killed 50,000 civilians who believed we would protect them." Thorne closed his eyes and saw faces from his past. Soldiers and civilians and enemies who had all looked the same in death. And he remembered why humanity had sworn to never again build the weapons he had once commanded. But he also remembered the promise buried in those same accords. The insurance policy that every human leader hoped would never need activation. And he knew that hope had died with New Canaan 24 hours later. Admiral Thorne stood in the command center beneath Geneva, where the Protocol Omega systems had waited in darkness for 2 centuries. And he placed his hand on the activation panel that required biometric confirmation from 5 living admirals who remembered the old ways the lights came on in sequence across the solar system as ancient commands traveled at light speed to installations that had been maintained in secret by a rotating cadre of engineers who passed the knowledge down through generations on Luna. Massive doors opened in Crater Tycho, where an entire fleet had slept in vacuum-sealed perfection for longer than most current officers had been alive. And the warships drifted out into space on automated systems that began running diagnostics Mars Orbital Station. Alpha detached its civilian sections to reveal a military core that had been hidden within the superstructure like a blade inside a walking stick, and weapons platforms that violated 17 galactic treaties, powered up with enough energy to crack a planet in the asteroid belt. Mining facilities that actually were mining facilities 90% of the time activated their secondary purpose, and production lines that had been dormant began assembling weapons that humanity had sworn to never use again. Thorne watched the reports coming in from across the system and felt the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar coat that he had hoped to never wear again. "How many ships total?" he asked the chief coordinator. And the answer came back with precision. 7,412 warships of various classes, Admiral, plus support vessels and automated defense platforms. The number seemed impossible, but Thorne knew it was real because he had helped design this system back when humanity was still fighting itself and leaders had nightmares about what would happen if they ever disbanded their military completely. The Cairo Accords had been a compromise that let humanity pretend to be peaceful while maintaining the capacity for overwhelming violence, and the galaxy had never suspected because humans seemed so genuinely committed to farming and building and exploring. Admiral Chun of the Pacific Fleet arrived at the command center within hours, followed by Admiral Okonkwo from the African Union Forces and Admiral Petrov from the Eurasian Coalition. Each of them pulled from civilian life or desk jobs to resume positions they had trained for but hoped never to use. "The clone programs," Thorne said to his assembled staff. "What's their status?" The ethics officer looked uncomfortable as he responded. "We shut them down 40 years ago, Admiral. But the facilities still exist, and the genetic templates are viable." Thorne nodded slowly because he had expected that answer, and he knew that what he was about to order violated the spirit of human dignity that the Accords had tried to preserve. "Activate them," he said quietly, "and accelerate the growth cycles to 18 months subjective time. We need soldiers who are trained and ready, not civilians playing at war." The room went silent because everyone understood what that meant. Thousands of human beings grown in tanks and force-educated through neural programming to be perfect warriors who would never know childhood or choice. "Sir," the ethics officer began. But Thorne cut him off with a look that carried the weight of New Canaan's ashes. We gave peace a chance for 200 years, the Admiral said. And the galaxy responded by murdering children. So now we give them the alternative. Intelligence Director Sarah Okafor presented the reconnaissance data her agents had gathered on the Zathran sovereignty. And the picture that emerged was of an empire built on subjugation and threat displays that had never faced serious resistance. They've conquered 47 species over the past 3 centuries. Okafor explained while holographic displays showed worlds and populations. And their standard procedure is to identify a target that can't fight back, destroy it publicly, then demand submission from surrounding territories. Admiral Chun studied the tactical readouts and nodded. So they're bullies who have never been punched back, which means they don't know how to respond to actual military force. Thorne agreed, but cautioned against underestimating any opponent regardless of their record, because overconfidence had killed more soldiers than superior firepower throughout human history. The propaganda division started broadcasting New Canaan's final hours across every communication channel in known space. Not the censored version that might spare feelings, but the raw, unedited footage of children burning and parents screaming. Galactic response was mixed, with some species expressing horror, while others remained neutral, and the Zathran sovereignty issued statements about the regrettable consequences of human territorial violations. They're claiming we provoked them, Admiral Okonkwo said with barely controlled rage, saying that New Canaan was established in disputed space. Thorne pulled up the colonial charter that showed New Canaan had been surveyed and claimed through proper galactic procedures, filed with the registry, and recognized by every neighboring power, including the Zathrans themselves. Doesn't matter what they claim, he said calmly, because we're not interested in diplomatic victory. We're interested in making an example that will last 1,000 years. The fleet began assembling in deep space beyond Pluto's orbit, where civilian traffic couldn't observe the full scope of what humanity was preparing. And the ships that emerged from mothballs were dark and angular things that looked nothing like the peaceful exploration vessels the galaxy knew. Weapons testing began in designated zones where humanity demonstrated capabilities that made the intelligence observers from other species file urgent reports back to their governments about the underestimated danger of human military technology. Railguns that could punch through capital ship armor at 3 light seconds distance, quantum destabilizer weapons that could make matter forget how to hold together, and swarm nanites that could consume a space station in minutes while replicating themselves. From the debris, these weapons are banned by the galactic conventions, a diplomatic observer from the Asari Federation protested when he saw the test results. Admiral Thorne looked at him with eyes that held no warmth. Humanity never signed those conventions because we knew someday we might need to use these. And today is that day. The diplomatic corps transformed from negotiators into psychological warfare specialists. And humans who had been known for fair dealing and honest trade became propagandists who knew exactly how to manipulate galactic media. Every broadcast included images of New Canaan before and after. Every diplomatic communication referenced the children who died. Every message carried the implicit threat that humanity's patience had limits that had now been exceeded. The Zathran sovereignty responded with their own propaganda about human aggression and the need for strong empires to discipline younger races. But their message fell flat when compared to actual footage of their warships murdering farmers 70 days after New Canaan fell. Admiral Thorne sent a message directly to the Zathran High Command through every channel available. And the message was simple enough that translation errors couldn't obscure the meaning. You took 6 hours to kill New Canaan. The message read, and we are coming for you in 90 days from the moment you received this. Prepare your defense because we will show you what 6 hours of human attention really means. The message included coordinates for the Zathran homeworld and a timestamp that counted down with precision. And the Zathran military scrambled to understand if this was a bluff or a genuine threat intelligence. Reports showed the Zathrans reinforcing their border territories and calling in their client species fleets. And Admiral Chun smiled grimly as he watched them prepare for a conventional war. "They still don't understand," he said to Thorn. "They think we're going to follow the established rules of engagement." Thorn nodded while watching the fleet complete its final preparations. They're about to learn that humanity wrote different rules. Then we buried them because we were afraid of ourselves. The Zathran border outpost at Kelmer Station represented the edge of their empire. A massive military installation that housed 15,000 soldiers and controlled the jump. Routes into 3 neighboring systems that paid tribute to the Sovereignty Station Commander Vrikith had reviewed the human threat with his officers and concluded it was typical primitive posturing from a species that didn't understand how galactic power actually worked, and he had ordered standard defensive preparations. While reporting to High Command that the situation was under control, the human fleet arrived 4 hours ahead of schedule without any of the preliminary skirmishing that normally preceded a major engagement. And Vrikith watched in confusion as nearly 300 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation surrounding his station. "Demand their surrender," he ordered, and prepare to fire a warning shot across their command vessel. The human response came in the form of a single transmission that showed images of New Canaan burning while a calm voice explained that Kelmer Station had exactly 5 minutes to evacuate all personnel before it ceased to exist. Vrikith laughed at the audacity and gave the order to open fire. But his weapons officer reported something impossible. The targeting systems couldn't lock onto the human ships because they were radiating electromagnetic signatures that confused the sensors' railgun rounds. Traveling at significant fractions of light speed tore through Kelmer Station's shields like they weren't there, and Vrikith had just enough time to realize he had made a terrible mistake before the command deck exploded around him. The station broke apart in 6 minutes of sustained bombardment, and the human fleet broadcast every moment of its destruction across local networks while repeating the message that this was the price for New Canaan. Admiral Chun commanded the border assault forces with 4,500 ships divided into strike groups that hit every major Zathran installation simultaneously. And the coordination required spoke of planning that had begun long before New Canaan fell. "They've been preparing for this," a Zathran intelligence analyst reported to High Command. "The humans knew exactly where to strike, and they're using weapons technology we've never seen before." The Zathran military response was hampered by the simple fact that their forces had been spread across conquered territories to maintain control. And when they tried to concentrate for a counterattack, the humans simply avoided direct engagement and struck at undefended targets. Supply convoys vanished in bursts of railgun fire. Communication relays dissolved into component atoms under quantum destabilizer beams. And automated defense platforms found themselves overwhelmed by swarms of nanites that consume metal and circuitry while replicating exponentially. The psychological warfare proved even more effective than the military strikes, because before each engagement the humans broadcast detailed lists of the New Canaan colonists who had died along with their ages and occupations. For Marcus Chun, age 47 farmer, the transmission would say, and then a Zathran supply depot would cease to exist. For little Amy Rodriguez, age 6 student, and another military outpost would vanish from the tactical maps. The Zathran client species watched these broadcasts and began questioning why they were risking destruction to protect an empire that had conquered them through threats and violence. And several systems declared neutrality despite Zathran demands for continued loyalty. Admiral Thorn had predicted this response, because bullies only maintain power through fear. And once someone demonstrates the bully can be hurt, then the facade of invincibility crumbles. The Karathi system had been conquered by the Zathrans 60 years earlier. And when human ships appeared in orbit, the Karathi defense minister took exactly 3 hours to agree to. Terms: surrender every Zathran, official and military officer on the planet in exchange for human neutrality. We have no quarrel with those who were forced to serve, Admiral Okonkwo told the Karathi government. But we will have justice for New Canaan, and that means every Zathran who participated in or supported their empire's policies. Within a week, 17 client species had surrendered Zathran personnel to human custody, and the trials began aboard specially designated ships where judges from neutral species presided over proceedings that were broadcast galaxy-wide. Accused Zathrans complained that they were only following orders, but the human prosecutors produced evidence of enthusiastic participation in atrocities across multiple worlds, including communications, celebrating the discipline of lesser species. You chose this, the lead prosecutor said during one trial, just as you chose to make New Canaan an example. And now humanity chooses to make you an example of what happens when you mistake our patience for weakness. The Zathran military attempted several counteroffensives that might have worked against conventional forces. But human tactics proved impossible to predict because they drew on 2 centuries of warfare experience that the galaxy had never witnessed. At the Battle of Theron Pass, a Zathran fleet of 800 ships tried to ambush a human supply convoy. But the convoy was a decoy, and the ambush became an encirclement when 2,000 human warships appeared from 3 different vectors simultaneously. The Zathran commander sued for surrender, but Admiral Chun broadcast his response across all channels. New Canaan never got the option to surrender. The Theron Pass engagement lasted 47 minutes and ended with complete Zathran annihilation, and the human fleet left the wreckage in orbit as a navigation hazard and a reminder. Zathran morale collapsed as news of defeat after defeat spread through their forces, and the High Command began pulling ships back toward the core systems in an attempt to create a defensive line that might hold against the human advance. Admiral Thorn recognized the retreat for what it was and deliberately slowed his advance to let the Zathrans concentrate their forces, because his goal wasn't just military victory, but a demonstration so overwhelming that no species would ever again consider attacking humanity. Let them fortify, he told his staff. Let them call in every ship and soldier they have, because when we break through their strongest defense, the entire galaxy will understand that humanity's mercy is a choice, not a necessity. The human fleet spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling outlying Zathran positions while their intelligence services infiltrated enemy communications and mapped out defensive preparations. Sarah Chun had been transferred to Admiral Thorn's flagship against her wishes because the medical staff worried about her mental state. But Thorn insisted she needed to see justice delivered. You're the last voice of New Canaan, he told her during a private meeting. And those people deserve to have a witness who remembers them as more than statistics. Sarah understood, but she still had nightmares about the sounds of her world dying. And sometimes she wondered if the vengeance being unleashed in her name was justice or just more violence, creating more trauma. The Zathran sovereignty controlled 73 systems at the start of the war. But by day 60 of the human campaign, they had been pushed back to their core 17 systems where military production and population centers created a fortress that conventional assault would struggle to crack. Galactic observers began speculating that the humans might accept and negotiate it. Peace now that they had demonstrated their military power. But those observers didn't understand the message humanity intended to send. We promised them 90 days, Admiral Thorne said when asked about peace negotiations. And we promised to show them what 6 hours means to humanity. Neither of those promises are negotiable. The Zathran High Command broadcast an offer of reparations and formal apologies, along with withdrawal from all conquered territories. But the human response was a simple countdown timer showing how many days remained until the assault on the Zathran homeworld. Day 78 saw the last major Zathran fleet destroyed at the Battle of Crimson Nebula, where 4,000 Zathran ships tried to break through human lines in a desperate attempt to strike at human logistics bases. The battle lasted 9 hours and cost humanity 300 ships. But the Zathran fleet ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force, and the survivors retreated toward Zathros Prime, with human pursuit forces harrying them every parsec. The galaxy watched in fascinated horror as the human fleet assembled at the edge of the Zathron home system on day 89, exactly as promised. And the transmission that followed made every diplomatic channel go silent. Admiral Thorne's face appeared on every screen in Zathran space, and his voice was calm as he delivered humanity's final message. You killed New Canaan in 6 hours and broadcast it as a warning to other species. Now we will destroy your military in 6 hours and broadcast it as a warning to the galaxy. The transmission continued with a detailed explanation of what the next 6 hours would bring. And the Zathrans realized with dawning horror that humanity wasn't bluffing or exaggerating. But first, Thorne added, we want you to understand why this is happening. So we're going to show you every face of every person you killed for the next 18 hours. Human broadcasts showed images and brief biographies of all 50,000 New Canaan colonists, from newborn infants to elderly grandparents, farmers and teachers and engineers and artists. The Zathrans were forced to see the individuals rather than statistics, and many civil. The Zathran home fleet numbered 2,300 warships arranged in defensive shells around their homeworld, with overlapping fields of fire and spatial mines seeded throughout the approach vectors in patterns that had been refined. Over 3 centuries of military dominance, Admiral Thorne studied the defensive setup from the command deck of Retribution and noted with professional appreciation that the Zathrans had learned something from their defeats. But learning and adapting were 2 different things. Their formations are solid, Admiral Chun observed from his position commanding the second wave, but they're designed to counter conventional assault tactics. Thorne nodded while his tactical staff highlighted weak points in the Zathran defense that wouldn't be apparent to commanders who had never faced truly innovative warfare. Human fleet had grown to 9,400 ships with reinforcements arriving from Sol, and the numerical advantage combined with technological superiority meant that the outcome was mathematically certain. But mathematics didn't capture the emotional weight of what was about to happen, and Thorne made sure every captain understood that this wasn't just a battle, but a message being written in fire that would be read for generations. All ships. He broadcast on the command channel. You know what we're here to do, and you know why it matters. Don't let mercy cloud your judgment, but don't let anger make you reckless. We owe New Canaan justice, not revenge. The countdown timer hit 0 at exactly the promised moment, and the human fleet surged forward in a coordinated assault that came from 4 different angles, simultaneously, and spatial mines detonated against the first wave of human drones that had been sent ahead specifically to clear the defenses. And the explosions created beautiful, deadly flowers of light against the darkness. The second wave consisted of electronic warfare ships that broadcast jamming signals across every spectrum. And suddenly, the Zathran coordination began breaking. down as communication between fleet elements became difficult. Wave 3 deployed the railgun cruisers that began methodical bombardment of the outer defensive shell from ranges. The Zathrans couldn't effectively return fire, and ships began dying before they could close to engagement. Distance Admiral Vekris commanded the Zathran home fleet from his flagship Eternal Dominion, and he realized within the first 15 minutes that his forces were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought with precision his people couldn't match. All ships concentrate fire on the human command vessel. He ordered, "If we can kill their admiral, the coordination will collapse." 200 Zathran ships broke formation to charge retribution, but they ran into a screen of human destroyers that had been positioned specifically to counter such tactics, and the resulting engagement destroyed 60 Zathran vessels in exchange for 7 human ships. Thorn watched the Zathran casualties mount and felt nothing but cold determination because he had learned long ago that emotion was a luxury commanders couldn't afford during battle. The first hour saw the outer defensive shell breached in 4 locations, as human ships poured through gaps created by concentrated fire, and the Zathrans began pulling ships back toward their second defensive line. But the second line had been designed assuming the outer line would inflict significant casualties on any attacker, and the human fleet had lost less than 3% of its strength. Quantum destabilizer weapons began targeting Zathran capital ships, and the results horrified observers as matter simply ceased maintaining molecular cohesion, and ships came apart without the mercy of quick explosions. That weapon violates the Galactic Conventions on Humane Warfare, a monitoring station from the Asari Federation transmitted. Admiral Chun responded with a simple statement: "The Galactic Conventions that humanity never signed, because we knew someday we'd need weapons that work." The second hour brought the human fleet into close engagement range where Zathran gunnery superiority might have mattered, but the humans deployed swarm nanite weapons that consumed incoming fire and converted it into more nanotessa. Zathran battleship fired a full salvo at a human carrier, but the missiles dissolved into component atoms 20 kilometers from their target, and the carrier responded with a barrage that erased the battleship from existence. Admiral Vekris knew he was losing, but he also knew that surrender wasn't an option because the humans had made it clear. They wanted complete destruction of Zathran military power. All ships fight to the last, he ordered, and show these primitives that Zathran honor demands we never yield. The third hour saw the second defensive line collapse completely as human ships began operating in orbital space around Zathros Prime itself, and the Zathran ground-based defenses opened fire in a desperate attempt to drive them off. Planetary defense cannons possessed enough power to threaten even capital ships, but human targeting systems had already mapped every installation during the approach, and surgical strikes eliminated the threat with minimal collateral damage to civilian areas. Thorn had given explicit orders that civilian casualties were to be avoided because humanity's quarrel was with the Zathran military and government, not with ordinary citizens who had no say in their empire's policies. "We're not here to become them," he had told his captains. "We're here to show the galaxy that justice can be delivered with precision." The fourth hour brought the assault on the Imperial Palace orbital station, where Sovereign Emperor Krexith had taken refuge along with his High Council and the core of the military command structure. Admiral Okonkwo led the assault personally with her finest Marines, and the boarding action that followed was brutal close quarters, fighting through corridors that ran with blood from both sides of Shathran. Imperial guards fought with desperate courage, knowing they were defending their civilization's leadership. But human Marines had been training for this specific scenario since the day New Canaan fell. Sarah Chum watched the assault from the observation deck of Retribution and felt her hands clenching with tension because she knew those Marines were dying to capture the beings responsible for her parents' deaths. The Palace Station's final defense position was the throne room itself, where Krexith had assembled his personal guard and declared he would die before surrendering to primitive mammals admiral. Okonkwo breached the throne room doors with shaped charges and led her team through smoke and fire to find the Sovereign Emperor standing behind a barrier of his finest warriors. Your choice. Okonkwo shouted over the sounds of weapons fire. Surrender and face trial, or die here, and prove you're as foolish as you are cruel. Krexith raised his weapon to fire, but his own guards turned on him, throwing down their arms and forcing their emperor to his knees, because they had seen enough death and understood that continued resistance was pointless. Capture of the Sovereign Emperor was broadcast live across the galaxy, and the image of the once mighty ruler being led away in restraints by a human female half his size became iconic. The fifth hour saw the last organized Zathran resistance collapse as word of their emperor's capture spread through the remaining fleet, and Admiral Vekris ordered a general surrender before more lives were wasted. But some ships refused and fought on until they were destroyed, and the human fleet granted them the warriors' death they sought while accepting surrender from those who chose survival. The sixth hour arrived with the Zathran military effectively destroyed, their orbital infrastructure under human control, and their leadership in custody awaiting trial. Admiral Thorn checked the chronometer and noted with satisfaction that the battle had taken 5 hours and 47 minutes, well within the promised 6-hour time frame. All ships cease offensive operations, he broadcast, and begin securing prisoners and providing humanitarian assistance to civilian population centers. The military phase is complete. Sarah Chun was brought to the palace station to confront Sovereign Emperor Krexith in his detention cell, and she stood outside the energy barrier, looking at the being who had ordered her world's destruction. "Do you even remember New Canaan?" she asked quietly. "Or were we just another statistic in your empire's expansion?" Krexith looked at her with eyes that held no remorse. "Your people violated territorial boundaries and refused proper tribute. The consequences were standard procedure." Sarah felt rage building in her chest, but she forced it down because giving in to anger would diminish the memory of everyone she had lost. "Standard procedure," she repeated. "That's what you call murdering 50,000 civilians, including children, too young to even understand what territory means." The Sovereign Emperor had no response because for the first time in his life, he was facing someone who had the power to truly hurt him, and his entire worldview was crumbling under the weight of consequences. "You're going to stand trial," Sarah told him, "and you're going to answer for every single person who died while you watched and called it policy. And when you're found guilty, you're going to spend the rest of your very long life thinking about the price of your choices." She turned and left before he could respond, because she had said what she came to say, and nothing he could add would change the fact that justice was finally coming for New Canaan. The human fleet settled into occupation positions around Zathros Prime while ground teams began securing government facilities and gathering evidence for the upcoming trials. 6 months had passed since the Battle of Zathros Prime, and the galaxy had settled into a new reality where humanity occupied a position of power that made diplomatic relationships suddenly much more respectful than they had been before New Canaan. The war crimes trials proceeded aboard Geneva Station, a massive neutral facility that orbited between systems and provided venue for justice that couldn't be dismissed as victors. Revenge Sovereign Emperor Krexith stood before judges, representing 23 different species, including 2 Zathrans who had been selected for their reputations for fairness. And the prosecution presented evidence that spanned 3 centuries of atrocities. The broadcasts reached every corner of known space as prosecutors detailed the systematic destruction of dozens of civilizations. And the courtroom displays showed images of burning worlds that made New Canaan look like just one example in a long pattern. The defense argues that these actions were necessary for maintaining order, the lead judge said. But the evidence shows that order built on terror isn't order at all, but rather tyranny masked as governance. Krexif's defenders tried arguing that he was simply following cultural traditions and that imposing human moral standards on Zathran society was itself a form of imperialism, but the prosecution countered with testimony from Zathran civilians and lower-ranking military officers who had opposed the policies and been silenced through intimidation. This wasn't culture, Admiral Okonkwo testified. This was conscious choice to murder civilians for political gain. And choice means responsibility regardless of what species you belong to. The trial lasted 3 months with evidence so overwhelming that even Krexith's own legal team privately admitted they were simply going through motions. The verdict came on a quiet morning when the head judge read the decision in a voice that carried no emotion because the facts spoke loudly. Enough. We find the accused guilty on all counts, including genocide, crimes against sapient beings, and deliberate targeting of civilian populations, the judge stated. And the sentence is life imprisonment without possibility of parole or early release. Krexith showed no reaction as he was led away to the transport that would take him to his permanent prison, a facility on a barren moon where he would spend decades in the same kind of underground tunnels where Sarah Chun had hidden while her world burned. The Zathran High Council members received similar sentences, and the galaxy watched as beings who had once commanded the fear and respect of dozens of species were reduced to prisoners in human custody. But humanity's treatment of ordinary Zathrans surprised many observers because, instead of collective punishment, the occupation forces provided food, assistance, and helped establish democratic institutions. Admiral Thorne had insisted on this approach despite calls from some human politicians for harsher measures, because he believed that punishing civilians for their government's crimes only created new cycles of hatred. We're showing them an alternative, he explained to skeptical reporters, proving that you can be strong without being cruel and that justice doesn't require revenge. The Zathron worlds under human administration began holding free elections for the first time in their history, and the results brought to power moderate leaders who immediately began negotiating peaceful transition back to self-governance. Asara Chen had become something of a celebrity despite her wishes, and at 16 she found herself invited to speak before the Galactic Assembly about the events that had reshaped interstellar politics. She stood at the podium feeling small and overwhelmed while representatives from 200 species watched her with varying degrees of curiosity and concern. I don't speak for all humans, she began. I only speak for the 50,000 people who died on New Canaan and can't speak for themselves anymore. The assembly hall went completely silent as she described her world before the attack, painting pictures of ordinary people doing ordinary things and building lives they thought would last. My mother grew the best tomatoes in the colony, Sarah said, and my father could fix any piece of machinery with just wire and patience. And my teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, kept 8 terrified children alive for 3 days because she refused to give up. She paused and looked directly at the assembly members. These weren't soldiers or politicians or anyone who had anything to do with galactic power games. They were farmers and teachers and children, and they died because someone decided killing them would send a message. The emotion in her voice wasn't anger, but rather sadness mixed with determination, and many in the audience found themselves unexpectedly moved. Humanity didn't want to wage war, she continued. We wanted to plant crops and raise families and maybe trade with our neighbors. But you can't build peace with people who view mercy as weakness. She gestured to the viewing screens that showed human fleet positions across former Zathran space. So now humanity maintains the largest active military fleet in known space. Not because we want to, but because we have to? Because the galaxy taught us that peaceful species get murdered unless they're also strong species. The speech concluded with words that would be quoted in diplomatic correspondence for decades. We'll be farmers among the stars if you let us, but we'll be warriors if you force us. And the choice of which one you're talking to is entirely yours to make. The Galactic Security Council underwent reorganization following the war, and humanity received a permanent seat with veto power despite protests from species that had held power for centuries. They earned it, the Usuri Federation representative said during the debate. Whether we like how they earned it or not, they demonstrated capabilities that make their inclusion necessary for galactic stability. Admiral Thorne attended the ceremony where humanity's ambassador took the oath of office, and he felt mixed emotions about what his actions had. Created Protocol Omega Fleet remained on active duty with over 7,000 warships, patrolling human space and conducting training exercises that neighboring species watched. Nervously, the clone soldier programs continued despite ethical objections because humanity had learned that maintaining peace required the credible threat of overwhelming response. Some of the clone soldiers integrated into regular society after their service terms, but others chose to remain in military service because combat was all they had ever known. Sarah Chun visited one of the clone training facilities and met soldiers who looked like they could be her older siblings. And she struggled with the knowledge that these people existed because of what had happened to her world. Do you regret it? She asked one of the clone sergeants. Being created for war instead of having a normal life. The sergeant considered the question carefully. I don't know what normal means, but I know that my existence has purpose, and that I'm protecting people who might otherwise end up like New Canaan. So no, I don't regret it. The answer didn't satisfy Sarah completely, but she understood that moral clarity was harder to achieve in reality than in philosophy classes. New Canaan Memorial was dedicated on the 1-year anniversary of the attack. A massive station that orbited the glassed remains of the colony world. 50,000 names were carved into stone. Walls quarried from Earth. Each name accompanied by a small biographical note about who they had been before they became statistics. Sarah walked through the memorial halls reading names and remembering faces. And she cried again for losses that time hadn't diminished. The dedication ceremony included representatives from every human colony and many alien species who wanted to pay respects. And the crowd numbered in the thousands. Admiral Thorne gave the keynote address in his dress uniform with medals that represented a career spent in service of humanity's survival. We built this memorial not as a monument to war, but as a reminder of why peace matters, he said. Every name on these walls represents someone who chose peaceful existence over military glory. He paused and his voice grew harder. But we also built this memorial as a warning to the galaxy that humanity will never again allow our peaceful civilians to be slaughtered without response. Sarah Chun took the podium after Thorne and spoke directly to the assembled crowd with a voice that had grown stronger over the past year. New Canaan wanted to be farmers, she said, and we succeeded for 20 years before someone decided we were convenient targets. So I stand here today to tell the galaxy that humanity remembers and humanity learns. She gestured to the memorial walls. These names are our promise that we will defend our colonies with every weapon we possess. And they're also our hope that someday we won't need to. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence while holographic projections showed images of New Canaan before the attack. And many in attendance wept for a world they had never known. The political situation stabilized over the following months as species that had considered testing humanity's resolve decided that discretion was wiser than confrontation. Several aggressive empires that had been expanding through intimidation suddenly found themselves receiving diplomatic visits from human Ambassadors who brought detailed intelligence about military capabilities and polite suggestions about reconsidering expansion plans. It's not a threat, one ambassador explained. It's just information sharing so you can make informed decisions about your foreign policy. The implicit threat was clear enough that most governments adjusted their behavior without requiring demonstrations.